David had always thought his grandfather's stories were just old man tales. Every Sunday dinner, Grandpa Joe would talk about the ranch in Pine Valley, Texas. He'd describe the rolling hills, the old oak trees, and the way the sunrise looked over the pastures. David would nod politely while thinking about his Monday morning meetings and the engineering projects waiting on his desk back in Houston. At 45, David had built a good life for himself. He worked as a senior engineer for a major construction company, owned a nice house in the suburbs, and had finally paid off his student loans. The last thing on his mind was becoming a rancher. He barely knew how to keep his lawn alive, let alone manage livestock and crops. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning in March. David was reviewing blueprints when his phone rang. The caller introduced herself as attorney Lisa Chen from Pine Valley. She spoke gently but directly. Grandpa Joe had passed away peacefully in his sleep 3 days earlier. David felt his world shift. Despite being 92, his grandfather had seemed unstoppable. Just last month, Joe had been talking about fixing the barn roof and planning his garden for spring. The funeral was small but meaningful. Old friends and neighbors shared stories about Joe that David had never heard. They talked about how he'd helped families during tough times, how he'd lent equipment when people needed it, and how he'd always had time to listen. David realized he'd only known one side of his grandfather, the storyteller. He'd never really understood the man who'd lived those stories. After the service, Attorney Chen asked David to stay behind. She had something important to discuss. They sat in her small office above the town's only coffee shop, and she pulled out a thick folder. Inside were documents that would change David's life forever. "Your grandfather left you everything," she said simply. "The ranch, the house, the equipment, and 200 acres of prime Texas land." David stared at the papers, unable to process what he was hearing. He'd expected maybe a few family photos or his grandfather's old pocket watch. The idea of inheriting an entire ranch felt surreal. "There's something else you need to know," Chen continued. "Your property is special. It sits right in the middle of a fancy neighborhood called Willowbrook Estates. They built their subdivision around your family's land in the 1990s. She pulled out a map and spread it across her desk. David could see his grandfather's property outlined in red, completely surrounding a development of expensive homes on 3 sides. The ranch looked like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit with the manicured lawns and modern houses around it. The developers needed to cross your grandfather's land to build roads and run utilities to their houses, Chen explained. So they signed a lease agreement with him back in 1994. They've been paying him rent ever since. David learned that Willowbrook Estates was home to doctors, lawyers, and business executives who'd paid premium prices for their houses. They'd moved there for the peace and quiet, away from the city's noise and traffic. What they probably didn't realize was that their peaceful neighborhood existed because of his grandfather's generosity. The lease payments weren't huge, just a few $100s a month. But Chen mentioned something that made David's eyebrows raise. The original 30-year lease was set to expire soon. The homeowners association would need to negotiate a new agreement if they wanted to keep using the roads and utilities that crossed his land. That weekend, David drove out to see the property for himself. As he turned off the main highway onto the long gravel driveway, he felt like he was entering a different world. The city stress seemed to melt away as he drove past pastures where cattle grazed peacefully under ancient oak trees. The farmhouse was older than he'd expected, but solid. Built in the 1940s, it had weathered decades of Texas storms and still stood strong. The wraparound porch was perfect for watching sunsets, and the kitchen windows looked out over rolling hills that stretched for miles. Walking through the house, David found traces of his family's history everywhere. Photos on the mantelpiece showed his great-grandfather breaking ground on the land in 1952. Back then, it wasn't easy for a black family to buy property anywhere, let alone 200 acres of prime real estate. His great-grandfather had worked 3 jobs to save enough money, and his determination had created something lasting. In the barn, David discovered equipment that looked like it belonged in a museum. But when he turned the key in the old tractor, it started on the first try. His grandfather had taken care of everything, maintaining it all with the same attention to detail he'd put into his stories. Standing on the front porch that first evening, David watched the sun set over land that now belonged to him. For the first time in years, his phone was silent. No emails, no urgent project deadlines, no traffic noise, just the sound of wind through the trees and cattle calling to each other in the distance. That night, David made a decision that surprised even him. He would keep the ranch, not as a business investment or a quick profit opportunity, but as a way to honor his grandfather's memory and connect with his family's roots. Over the next few months, David split his time between Houston and the ranch. He kept his engineering job but started spending every weekend in Pine Valley. Slowly, he began to understand why his grandfather had loved this place so much. David invested his savings into fixing up the property. He hired local contractors to update the farmhouse plumbing and electrical systems. The old roof got new shingles, and the faded exterior got a fresh coat of paint. He replaced broken fence posts and upgraded the barn with modern lighting and ventilation. The work was harder than any engineering project he'd tackled, but also more satisfying. Each improvement felt personal. When he installed new windows in the kitchen, he imagined his grandmother cooking Sunday dinner. When he repaired the front gate, he thought about all the people who'd driven through it over the years. Local residents were friendly and welcoming. They remembered his grandfather fondly and seemed happy that David planned to continue the family tradition. The feed store owner gave him advice about caring for the pastures. The veterinarian who'd worked with Joe for decades offered to help David learn about managing the small herd of cattle that came with the property. As summer arrived, David felt more at home on the ranch than he had anywhere else. He was learning to read the weather by watching cloud formations and could tell time by the sun's position. His hands were getting calloused from fence work, and his engineer's pale complexion was turning brown from outdoor work. The ranch was becoming more than just inherited property. It was becoming David's sanctuary, a place where he could disconnect from the corporate world and reconnect with something more fundamental. Every weekend, as he drove down that gravel driveway, he felt like he was coming home. What David didn't know was that his presence hadn't gone unnoticed by his neighbors in Willowbrook Estates. While he was falling in love with ranch life, some people on the other side of the fence were making very different plans for his future. David first met his neighbors on a Saturday morning in July. He was replacing a section of fence when a woman in a white golf cart pulled up to the property line. She wore expensive sunglasses and had the kind of perfect hair that suggested regular salon visits. Her smile looked practiced, like something she'd rehearsed in the mirror. "You must be Joe's grandson," she said, though her tone suggested she already knew exactly who he was. "I'm Patricia Wells, president of the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. We've been meaning to introduce ourselves." David wiped his hands on his jeans and walked over to meet her. He'd been looking forward to getting to know his neighbors. In Houston, he barely spoke to the people living next door. Out here, he hoped, things would be different. Patricia's handshake was firm, but her eyes kept scanning the ranch property behind him. She made comments about the rustic charm of his grandfather's place, though something in her voice suggested she didn't mean it as a compliment. "Your grandfather was quite a character," she continued. "Very set in his ways, if you know what I mean. I'm sure a young professional like yourself will want to modernize things around here." David wasn't sure what she meant by modernize, but he nodded politely. Patricia went on to explain how Willowbrook Estates prided itself on maintaining high property values and community standards. She mentioned their architectural review committee and suggested David might want to attend their next HOA meeting. "We're always happy to help new residents understand how things work around here," she said. The way she emphasized how things work made it sound less like an offer and more like a warning. After Patricia left, David thought the conversation had gone well enough. Maybe she'd been a little formal, but wealthy neighborhoods probably had their own social rules. He went back to work on the fence, not thinking much more about it. The first complaint letter arrived 3 days later. David found the certified mail notice when he got home from work on Tuesday. The official-looking envelope was from the Willowbrook Estates HOA, addressed to the owner of 1247 Ranch Road. Inside was a formal complaint about excessive noise disturbance caused by industrial equipment operation during early morning hours. David read the letter twice, confused. The only equipment he'd used was his grandfather's old tractor, and he'd been careful to avoid working too early or too late. He'd started around 9 in the morning and finished by late afternoon, well within any reasonable noise ordinance. The letter demanded that he cease all disruptive activities and threatened fines if the violations continued. It was signed by Patricia Wells and included copies of supposed noise complaints from multiple residents. David called the phone number listed on the letterhead. Patricia's voice was considerably less friendly than it had been during their face-to-face meeting. The residents of Willowbrook Estates moved here for peace and quiet, she explained coldly. Agricultural noise at all hours is simply unacceptable in a residential area. But I only use the tractor for a few hours in the middle of the day, David protested. And this is a working ranch. Surely there's some allowance for normal farm activities. Normal farm activities, Patricia repeated as if the words tasted bad. Mr. Thompson, we're trying to maintain a certain quality of life here. Your grandfather understood that. We hope you'll be equally considerate. The conversation ended with Patricia suggesting David review the county noise ordinances and adjust his activities accordingly. David hung up feeling frustrated and confused. His grandfather had worked this land for decades. Had he really been causing problems all those years? The second letter came a week later. This time the complaint was about unsightly agricultural equipment visible from the subdivision. The HOA demanded that David remove or relocate several pieces of farm equipment that could be seen from Willowbrook Estates properties. David walked his fence line, trying to see his property from his neighbor's perspective. The equipment in question included a hay baler, a stock trailer, and an old windmill that had been there since before the subdivision was built. All of it was functional and necessary for ranch operations. This time, David decided to attend the next HOA meeting to address their concerns directly. He put on his best business clothes and drove over to the Willowbrook Estates clubhouse on Thursday evening. The clubhouse was impressive. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and oil paintings of pastoral scenes that probably cost more than David's truck. About 30 residents attended the meeting, all of them well-dressed and clearly affluent. Patricia ran the meeting with military precision. When David raised his hand during the open comment period, a few people turned to stare. He introduced himself politely and explained that he wanted to address the recent complaints about his property. I understand there are concerns about noise and equipment visibility, he began. I'm happy to work with everyone to find reasonable solutions. My grandfather farmed this land for 70 years, and I'm hoping we can continue to be good neighbors. The response was not what he'd expected. A man in an expensive suit immediately stood up. With all due respect, Mr. Thompson, this is a residential neighborhood now. Property values here depend on maintaining certain standards. Having farm equipment scattered around doesn't exactly fit with our community image. A woman near the back chimed in. We paid premium prices for homes in a quiet upscale area. Constant tractor noise and industrial activities really impact our quality of life. David tried to explain that he only worked during reasonable daytime hours, and that the equipment was necessary for maintaining the ranch. But he could see that many residents had already made up their minds. To them, he wasn't a neighbor trying to preserve his family's legacy. He was a problem to be solved. Patricia eventually called for order and suggested that David take some time to consider how his activities affect the broader community. The meeting moved on to other business, leaving David feeling isolated and unwelcome. As he walked back to his truck, David overheard conversations that made his stomach turn. People talked about property value impacts and changing neighborhood character in ways that felt loaded with meaning. When someone mentioned keeping our community standards high, David wondered exactly what standards they were talking about. The third letter was waiting for him the following Monday. This time, the HOA was demanding that he remove his grandfather's old water tower, claiming it was an eyesore that violated county building codes. They also insisted that he obtain permits for structures that had been on the property for decades. David, called Patricia directly, his patience wearing thin. Mrs. Wells, that water tower has been there since 1955. It's a functional part of the ranch's water system. Removing it would cost thousands of dollars and serve no practical purpose. Mr. Thompson, Patricia replied, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "We're simply trying to help you understand local regulations. The county has very specific codes about structures visible from residential areas. We wouldn't want you to face legal problems down the road." Legal problems? For a water tower that's been grandfathered in for 70 years? Things change, Mr. Thompson. Regulations evolve. What was acceptable in the past may not meet today's standards. David realized he was fighting something bigger than noise complaints or equipment visibility. This wasn't about reasonable community standards. This was about control. The harassment continued through the summer. The HOA found new violations every week. They complained about dust from his gravel driveway. They said his fence repairs didn't meet their aesthetic standards. They even objected to him hosting a small family barbecue, claiming it violated county regulations about public gatherings. Each complaint came with threats about reporting him to county authorities or taking legal action. David spent more time responding to HOA letters than he did enjoying his property. He tried reasoning with individual neighbors, but most seemed to have bought into Patricia's narrative about protecting property values. A few were sympathetic in private but unwilling to speak up publicly. The message was clear: conform to their vision or face constant harassment. David began to understand what his grandfather had endured in silence all those years. Joe had probably dealt with similar pressure but had chosen to keep the peace rather than fight back. His grandfather had been from a generation that believed in avoiding conflict whenever possible, but David was not his grandfather. He'd spent his career solving complex engineering problems, and he'd learned that some problems required creative solutions. As the harassment intensified, David began to think less about keeping the peace and more about protecting his family's legacy. One evening in late August, as David sat on his front porch reading another threatening letter from the HOA, he made a decision. If Patricia Wells and her neighbors wanted to play hardball, he would be happy to accommodate them. But first, he needed to understand exactly what kind of game they were playing. David walked into his grandfather's old office and began pulling out boxes of documents. Somewhere in all those papers were the original agreements between his family and the subdivision developers. It was time to learn exactly what rights his neighbors thought they had, and what rights they actually possessed. The black Mercedes pulled up David's driveway on a Friday afternoon in September. From his kitchen window, David watched two people in expensive suits get out of the car. The man carried a leather briefcase and walked with the kind of confidence that comes from years of intimidating people for a living. The woman was Patricia Wells, though she looked more serious than usual. David opened the front door before they could knock. He'd been expecting this visit ever since the HOA's complaints had escalated from noise violations to accusations about unpermitted structures and zoning violations, Mr. Thompson, the man said, extending his hand with a practiced smile. "I'm Robert Crawford, attorney for the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. I believe you know Mrs. Wells." David shook Crawford's hand, noting the firm grip and the expensive watch. Everything about the lawyer screamed high-priced legal muscle, from his Italian shoes to his perfectly styled gray hair. "We were hoping to discuss a business proposition with you," Crawford continued. "May we come in?" David led them to his living room, where his grandfather's old furniture looked suddenly shabby compared to his visitor's polished appearance. Crawford sat forward in his chair like a man used to controlling conversations. "Mr. Thompson, I'll get straight to the point. My clients have been reviewing the situation with your property, and frankly, there are some serious legal concerns." Crawford opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. He spread several documents across the coffee table with the dramatic flair of someone who'd done this many times before. "We've identified multiple code violations, zoning issues, and structural problems that could result in significant legal liability for you. The county inspector's office has been very cooperative in helping us document these issues." David picked up one of the papers. It was an official-looking citation for unpermitted agricultural structures in a residential zone. Another document claimed his water tower violated current safety regulations. A third accused him of operating a commercial enterprise without proper permits. "I don't understand," David said slowly. "These structures have been here for decades. My grandfather never had any of these problems." Patricia Wells leaned forward with what she probably thought was a sympathetic expression. David, regulations. Change over time. What was acceptable when your grandfather started farming might not meet today's standards. We're trying to help you avoid serious legal trouble. Crawford nodded. Gravely. The fines alone could reach hundreds of thousands of dollars, and if someone were injured on your property due to these violations, you could face personal liability that would wipe out everything you own. David felt his chest tighten. As an engineer, he understood legal liability better than most people. If there really were serious code violations, the financial consequences could be devastating. However, Crawford continued, his tone shifting to something almost friendly, my clients are prepared to offer you a solution. He pulled out another document, this one printed on expensive paper with gold letterhead. The Willowbrook Estates Community Foundation is prepared to purchase your property for $400,000. Cash. You could close within 30 days and walk away from all these potential legal problems. David stared at the offer letter. $400,000 was a lot of money, but he knew his property was worth much more. The land alone was probably worth over $1 million, not counting the improvements he'd made. $400,000 seems low for 200 acres of prime real estate, David said carefully. Crawford's expression didn't change. Mr. Thompson, you need to consider the full picture. Legal battles over these code violations could drag on for years and cost you everything. Property with serious compliance issues isn't worth market value. We're offering you a fair price for property with significant legal problems. Patricia added her own pressure. David, we're neighbors. We don't want to see you destroyed by legal fees and fines. This offer gives you a clean exit and a chance to start fresh somewhere else. Crawford pulled out one more document, this one clearly legal and intimidating. This is a formal notice of our intent to pursue enforcement action on the code violations. You have 72 hours to accept our purchase offer. After that, we'll have no choice but to proceed with legal action. David's hands shook slightly as he read the legal notice. It listed dozens of supposed violations and threatened immediate action if they weren't corrected. The estimated cost of bringing everything into compliance was listed as, potentially, exceeding $500,000. 72 hours? David asked. That's not much time to make such a major decision. Legal matters don't wait for convenience, Crawford replied coldly. The violations exist whether you address them now or later. We're simply giving you an opportunity to avoid the inevitable legal consequences. Patricia tried to soften the blow. David, I know this is hard. Your grandfather was stubborn about these issues too. But sometimes you have to be practical. $400,000 is enough to buy a nice place somewhere else and still have money left over. Crawford stood up and gathered his papers. You have until Monday at 5 p.m. to accept our offer. After that, the legal proceedings begin immediately. And I should mention, once we file formal complaints with the county, this property will be essentially unsellable. No bank will finance a purchase with pending code violation cases. As they walked toward the door, Crawford made one final comment that felt like a threat wrapped in friendly advice. Mr. Thompson, I've been practicing law for 25 years. Trust me when I say that fighting City Hall is expensive and usually futile. Smart businessmen know when to cut their losses. David watched the Mercedes drive away, his mind racing. 72 hours to decide whether to abandon his family's legacy or risk financial ruin in a legal battle against well-funded neighbors who clearly wanted him gone. That evening, David called his own attorney in Houston. Gary Martinez had handled David's real estate purchases and knew something about property law. When David explained the situation, Gary's response wasn't encouraging. David, these HOA attorneys know how to work the system. Even if their complaints are bogus, defending against them will cost you tens of thousands in legal fees. And if they've really got the county inspector on their side, you could be facing legitimate problems. But Gary, some of these structures have been here since the 1950s. Surely there are grandfather clauses or something. There should be, but proving it requires documentation. Do you have the original building permits, survey records, environmental impact studies? If they're claiming code violations, You'll need paperwork to prove everything was legal when it was built. David's heart sank. His grandfather hadn't been the type to keep detailed records. Most of the ranch buildings had been constructed by Joe himself or with help from neighbors. The idea of permits and inspections probably never crossed his mind. That night, David couldn't sleep. He walked around the ranch property, looking at everything with new eyes. Was the old barn really a safety hazard? Did the water tower violate some obscure regulation? Had his grandfather unknowingly been breaking laws for decades? Saturday morning brought no relief. David found himself second-guessing every improvement he'd made to the property. The new fence he'd been so proud of. Had he pulled the proper permits? The electrical work in the barn, was it up to current code? By Saturday afternoon, David was starting to think that maybe Crawford was right. Maybe the smart move was to take the money and walk away. $400,000 was enough to buy a smaller place somewhere else. He could stay in Houston, focus on his engineering career, and avoid this whole mess. But every time he considered accepting the offer, David thought about his great-grandfather breaking ground on this land in 1952. He thought about the discrimination his family had faced, the hard work they'd put into building something lasting, and the pride his grandfather had taken in preserving it all. On Sunday morning, David sat on his front porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sunrise over the pastures. This was the view his grandfather had loved, the peace his family had worked so hard to achieve. The idea of giving it up to satisfy some wealthy neighbors who wanted him gone felt like betrayal. As the deadline approached, David realized he was angry. Not just frustrated or worried, but genuinely angry. The whole situation felt like extortion dressed up in legal language. Pay us what we demand, or we'll destroy you in court. Sunday evening, David made his decision. He wouldn't be intimidated into selling his family's legacy for a fraction of its value. If Patricia Wells and her HOA wanted a fight, he would give them one. But first, he needed to understand exactly what he was fighting for. David spent Sunday night in his grandfather's office, pulling out every box of old documents he could find. Somewhere in all those papers were the original agreements his family had signed with the subdivision developers. If Crawford wanted to play legal games, David would learn the rules. Monday morning came too quickly. David's phone rang at 9 a.m. sharp. It was Crawford, calling to confirm whether David would accept their generous offer. "Mr. Crawford," David said, his voice steady despite his racing heart, "I need you to know that I reject your offer completely. This ranch has been in my family for 3 generations, and it's not for sale at any price." There was a long pause before Crawford responded. When he did, his voice had lost all pretense of friendliness. "Mr. Thompson, you're making a serious mistake. By 5 p.m. today, we'll file formal complaints with the county. By the end of the week, you'll be facing legal problems that will make our offer look like winning the lottery." "I understand the risks," David replied, "but some things are worth fighting for." After hanging up, David sat in his grandfather's chair and wondered if he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life. In a few hours, he would be at war with neighbors who had more money, better lawyers, and the local authorities on their side. But as David looked around the office where his grandfather had planned 70 years of farming, he felt something unexpected. Not fear or regret, but determination. His family had faced bigger challenges than a hostile HOA. They'd built something worth preserving, and David wasn't going to let it go without a fight. David spent Monday night surrounded by cardboard boxes, manila folders, and decades of yellowed paperwork. His grandfather's office looked like a tornado had hit it, with documents scattered across every surface. The 5 p.m. deadline had passed, and Crawford's threats were now reality. By tomorrow, David would officially be facing legal action from the county. But something his grandfather used to say kept echoing in David's mind. Every problem has a solution if you look hard enough. Joe had been talking about fixing broken equipment, but David hoped the same principle applied to legal problems. The first box contained mostly receipts and tax records going back to the 1960s. David found bills for feed, veterinary services, and equipment repairs, but nothing that looked legally significant. The second box was more of the same. farming expenses, insurance papers, and correspondence with neighbors about borrowing tools. By midnight, David was starting to lose hope. Maybe Crawford was right. Maybe his grandfather really had been operating outside the law all these years, and David was just too naive to see it. Then he opened the third box. At the bottom, underneath layers of farming journals and weather records, David found a manila envelope marked "Legal Papers Important." Inside were documents that made his heart race: property deeds, survey maps, and most importantly, a contract dated September 15, 1994. The contract was between Joseph Thompson and Willowbrook Development Corporation. David read it twice to make sure he understood what he was seeing. Then he read it again and started laughing. The document wasn't just about utility easements as David had originally thought. It was a comprehensive lease agreement that gave Willowbrook Development the right to build and maintain roads across the Thompson Ranch property. Without these roads, there would be no way for residents to reach their expensive homes. David traced the route on the attached survey map. The main entrance to Willowbrook Estates crossed his family's land for nearly half a mile. Two secondary roads also crossed Thompson property, providing the only reasonable access to about 60% of the homes in the subdivision. But that wasn't the most interesting part. The lease was for 30 years, with monthly payments of $200. David checked the dates carefully. The lease had expired 3 months ago in June. Since then, the Willowbrook Estates HOA had been using his family's land without permission. David kept digging through the documents. He found copies of checks from the early years, showing regular lease payments. Then he found bank statements showing automatic deposits continuing right up until the lease expired. For 30 years, his grandfather had been quietly collecting rent from the people who were now trying to force him off his own land. There was more. The original development agreement included provisions for water lines, electrical infrastructure, and even the fancy stone entrance gates that welcomed visitors to Willowbrook Estates. All of it was built on Thompson property under the lease agreement that had just expired. David pulled out his laptop and started researching property law. What he learned made him smile wider with each article he read. Without a valid lease agreement, the Homeowners Association had no legal right to maintain roads, utilities, or structures on his property. They were essentially trespassing on a massive scale. By 3 a.m., David had a complete picture of the situation. The HOA's threats about code violations were probably bogus, designed to pressure him into selling quickly. But even if some violations were legitimate, David now held much bigger leverage than anything Crawford could throw at him. The next morning, David called his attorney in Houston. "Gary, I need you to research something for me immediately. If a lease agreement expires and the landlord doesn't renew it, what happens to roads and utilities that were built under the original lease?" Gary was quiet for a moment. "Well, technically, the property owner has the right to demand removal of any structures built under the expired lease. Why do you ask?" David explained what he'd discovered in his grandfather's papers. He could hear Gary getting more excited as the legal implications became clear. "David, this changes everything. If they're using your land without permission, you can demand immediate cessation of trespassing. You could literally block their roads tomorrow if you wanted to. What about their threats to file code violations with the county?" Those threats just became meaningless. You hold all the cards now. They need you more than you need them. Without access across your property, half their neighborhood is worthless. David felt a surge of confidence he hadn't experienced since this whole mess started. "Gary, I want you to draft a formal notice terminating their use of my property, but I also want to offer them a new lease agreement." "What kind of terms are you thinking?" David had been doing calculations all morning. The original lease was $200 a month and $1994. Adjusted for inflation and current market rates, fair rent for road access across my property should be about $100 to $800 per month. Gary whistled softly. "That's quite an increase. Are you sure you want to ask for that much?" "Gary, they just tried to steal my entire ranch for $400,000. I think $1,800 a month for road access is more than reasonable." While Gary worked on the legal documents, David spent the day researching the Willowbrook Estate subdivision. He learned that property values there averaged over $800,000 per home. The monthly HOA fees were already $350 per household, so an additional $30 per month per home to cover road access wouldn't bankrupt anyone. David also discovered something interesting about Patricia Wells. She'd been HOA president for 5 years and had a reputation for aggressive tactics. Online forums showed complaints from previous neighbors who'd been pressured to conform to her vision of community standards. Wednesday morning brought a visit from a county inspector, just as Crawford had threatened. The man was polite but thorough, examining every structure on David's property with obvious suspicion. David was courteous and cooperative, but he didn't volunteer any information. "I'll need to write up my report," the inspector said as he prepared to leave. "Some of these older structures might need to be brought up to current code." "I understand," David replied calmly. "My attorney will be in touch if we have any questions about the requirements." The inspector seemed surprised by David's relaxed attitude. Most property owners facing code violation threats were nervous and defensive. David's confidence clearly puzzled him. That afternoon, Gary called with good news. "I've finished the legal notice. It formally terminates their right to use your property and offers a new lease agreement. I'm having it hand-delivered to their attorney this afternoon. How long do they have to respond?" "I gave them 48 hours to accept the new lease terms. After that, you have the legal right to block access to their roads." David spent Wednesday evening planning his next moves. If the HOA refused his lease offer, he would need to be prepared to actually block the roads. That meant barriers, signs, and probably security cameras to document any attempts to trespass. But David suspected it wouldn't come to that. Crawford was a smart lawyer, and smart lawyers don't fight battles they can't win. Once the HOA realized their legal position, they would have no choice but to negotiate. Thursday morning, David's phone started ringing early. The first call was from Patricia Wells, her voice noticeably different from their previous conversations. "David, I think there's been some misunderstanding about the lease situation. Could we possibly meet to discuss this?" "I'm happy to discuss anything, Mrs. Wells. But my attorney has made our position clear. The old lease expired and we're offering reasonable terms for a new agreement." $1,800 a month seems rather steep for what amounts to an informal arrangement. David almost laughed. "Mrs. Wells, 3 days ago your attorney was threatening to destroy me financially over made-up code violations. Now you want to call road access an informal arrangement?" There was a long pause. "Perhaps we could negotiate something more reasonable. The terms are fair and non-negotiable. You have until tomorrow afternoon to accept them." The second call came from Crawford himself. His tone was professional, but David could hear the frustration underneath. "Mr. Thompson, my clients are prepared to discuss a modified lease agreement. Perhaps we could find some middle ground on the monthly fee." "Mr. Crawford, you had your chance to negotiate when you walked into my house with threats and ultimatums. The terms are $1,800 per month, month to month, with a provision that any further harassment of the property owner results in immediate termination. That harassment clause is completely unreasonable." "Is it?" "Because from where I sit, 6 months of bogus complaints and code violation threats looks a lot like harassment. My neighbors need to decide whether they want to be good neighbors or continue playing legal games." David hung up feeling better than he had in months. For the first time since inheriting the ranch, he was the one setting the terms instead of responding to threats. Thursday evening, David walked his property line, looking at the roads that crossed his land. Tomorrow, he would find out whether Patricia Wells and her HOA were smart enough to recognize reality. If they weren't, David was prepared to show them exactly what happened when you tried to steal from the wrong person. As the sun set over his grandfather's pastures, David felt a deep satisfaction. Joe had built something worth fighting for, and his grandson had found a way to protect it. The next 24 hours would determine whether the Willowbrook Estates HOA learned to respect the Thompson family legacy or learned an expensive lesson about the consequences of greed. Friday morning arrived with crisp autumn air and the kind of clarity that comes after a long storm. David stood on his front porch at sunrise, coffee mug in hand, watching deer graze in the pasture where his great-grandfather had first broken ground 70 years ago. In a few hours, he would find out whether Patricia Wells and her HOA were smart enough to accept reality. The deadline was 2 p.m. David had spent the morning doing routine ranch work, checking fence lines and filling water troughs. The physical labor helped calm his nerves and reminded him why this land was worth fighting for. Every acre represented decades of his family's hard work and sacrifice. At 11 a.m., Gary called from Houston with an update. "David, I'm getting calls from their attorney. Crawford sounds desperate. He's asking for extensions, trying to negotiate lower monthly fees, anything to avoid signing your lease agreement." "What did you tell him?" "That the terms are non-negotiable and the deadline stands. I also reminded him that after 2 p.m. you have every legal right to block access to their roads." David smiled. "Good. Let them sweat for a few more hours. There's something else you should know. I've been doing research on Patricia Wells and her HOA tactics. This isn't the first time she's tried to pressure people into selling property. 3 years ago, she went after an elderly widow whose backyard bordered their golf course. Same pattern: harassment, bogus violations, legal threats. What happened? The woman sold for a fraction of what her property was worth. The HOA turned her backyard into an expanded putting green." David felt his jaw tighten. Patricia wasn't just protecting property values. She was a predator who targeted vulnerable people to expand her neighborhood's footprint. The difference was that David wasn't vulnerable, and he wasn't backing down. At 1:30 p.m., David's phone rang. The caller ID showed Patricia Wells's number. "David, please, we need to talk. This lease agreement is going to bankrupt our homeowners association." "Mrs. Wells, your HOA manages a neighborhood where the average home costs $800,000. The monthly fees to cover road access work out to about $30 per household. I hardly think that qualifies as bankruptcy. But David, we've been paying your grandfather $200 a month for 30 years. This increase is completely unreasonable." David had been waiting for this conversation. "Mrs. Wells, let me explain something to you. 3 days ago, your attorney walked into my home and threatened to destroy me financially unless I sold my ranch for a quarter of its actual value. You spent 6 months harassing me with bogus complaints and code violations. You tried to steal my family's legacy through intimidation and legal threats." Patricia started to interrupt, but David continued. "Now you want me to feel sorry for you, because you can't afford fair market rent for using my property? The answer is no. You have 30 minutes to accept my lease terms, or tomorrow morning I start blocking the roads." "You can't do that. People live here. They need access to their homes." "Then I suggest you sign the lease agreement." David hung up and checked his watch. 28 minutes left. At 1:55 p.m., Crawford called. "Mr. Thompson, my clients are prepared to accept your lease terms under protest. We'll need time to draft a formal response." "Mr. Crawford, it's a simple yes or no question. Do you accept the lease agreement as written?" There was a long pause. David could hear muffled conversation. In the background, probably Crawford consulting with Patricia and other HOA board members. "Yes," Crawford said finally. "We accept your terms." "Excellent. My attorney will send over the paperwork this afternoon. First month's rent is due within 10 days. After hanging up, David felt a mixture of satisfaction and relief. He'd won, but it had been a closer fight than he'd expected. If he hadn't found those old lease documents, Crawford's legal threats might have worked. That evening, David's phone didn't stop ringing. Word had spread quickly through Willowbrook Estates about the new lease agreement. Most of the calls were from angry residents who blamed David for their increased HOA fees, but not all the calls were hostile. Around 8 p.m., David answered his phone to hear an unfamiliar woman's voice. "Mr. Thompson? This is Helen Murphy. I live on Oakwood Drive in Willowbrook Estates. I wanted to call and thank you." David was surprised. "Thank me for what?" "For standing up to Patricia Wells and her bullying tactics. She's been terrorizing people in this neighborhood for years. Most of us were too scared to fight back. Helen went on to explain that Patricia had pressured dozens of residents into expensive home modifications and landscape changes to meet her vision of community standards. People who couldn't afford the improvements were harassed until they sold their homes and moved away. When word got around about how she tried to steal your ranch, a lot of us were disgusted. Patricia doesn't represent this community. She represents her own power trip. More calls followed. David learned that many residents were actually relieved to see Patricia's authority challenged. The additional $30 per month was a small price to pay to see their dictatorial HOA president brought down to size. Saturday morning brought an unexpected visitor. David looked out his kitchen window to see a small sedan pulling up his driveway. An elderly black man got out and walked slowly toward the house. David opened the door before the man could knock. "Can I help you?" The visitor smiled and extended his hand. "Mr. Thompson, I'm Charles Washington. I live about 10 miles down the road. I knew your grandfather well." David invited Charles in for coffee, curious about what had brought him out on a Saturday morning. "I heard about your trouble with the Willowbrook folks," Charles said. "Your grandfather would be proud of how you handled it." "You really think so?" "I wasn't sure Joe would approve of all the conflict." Charles laughed. "Son, your grandfather was tougher than you think. He just picked his battles carefully. He told me years ago that Patricia Wells and her crowd were trouble. Said they'd try to push you around sooner or later. He knew this was coming. Joe was a smart man. He saw how they treated other people in the area. He also knew that lease agreement would expire eventually. I think he was counting on you being strong enough to handle them when the time came." Charles pulled a folded paper from his shirt pocket. "Your grandfather asked me to give you this if you ever had trouble with the HOA. He made me promise to wait until after he was gone." David unfolded the paper. It was a letter in his grandfather's familiar handwriting. "David," the letter began, "if you're reading this, it means Patricia Wells and her friends have finally shown their true colors. Don't let them steal what our family built. The land is yours by right, and they need you more than you need them. Stand your ground, but be smart about it. Sometimes the best way to win a fight is to make the other side fight themselves. Your great-grandfather would have done the same thing. Love, Grandpa Joe." David felt tears in his eyes. His grandfather had seen this conflict coming and had trusted David to handle it correctly. Over the following weeks, the Willowbrook Estates HOA paid their rent on time and without complaint. Patricia Wells remained as HOA president, but her authority was significantly diminished. Several residents had filed complaints about her management style, and there was talk of electing new leadership. David's relationship with his neighbors gradually improved. Many residents realized that he was a reasonable person who just wanted to be left alone to enjoy his family's property. The harassment stopped completely, and some neighbors even became friendly. The lease payments provided David with steady income that helped fund ranch improvements. He used the money to restore his grandfather's barn, upgrade the fencing, and eventually expand the small cattle herd. The ranch began to feel like the working farm it had always been meant to be. 6 months later, David was repairing a gate when Patricia Wells drove up in her golf cart. She looked older and less confident than during their first meeting. "David, I wanted to apologize for how things went last year. I may have been too aggressive in trying to protect our community standards." David wiped his hands on his jeans and walked over to meet her. "I appreciate that, Mrs. Wells. I never wanted to be anyone's enemy. I just wanted to keep my family's land. For what it's worth, I think your grandfather would be proud of what you've done with the place. It looks better than it has in years." After Patricia left, David stood looking out over the pastures where his cattle grazed peacefully. The sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, just like in his grandfather's stories. David had learned something important about standing up for what mattered. His grandfather had preserved this land through decades of quiet determination. David had protected it through a different kind of strength, the willingness to fight when fighting was necessary. The ranch was still in the Thompson family, and David intended to keep it that way. He'd learned that some people would always try to take what didn't belong to them. But he'd also learned that sometimes the best defense was making sure they needed you more than you needed them. As the stars came out over the Texas hills, David felt grateful for the grandfather who'd taught him the value of hard work, the attorney who'd taught him the value of good legal advice, and the hostile neighbors who'd taught him the value of standing his ground. The Willowbrook Estates HOA continued paying their rent every month right on time, and David continued enjoying his weekends on the ranch, secure in the knowledge that his family's legacy was protected for future generations.